So uh, in our seat is Dr. Chika Mba, is a research fellow at the Institute of African Studies in the Religion and Philosophy section of the institute. And Dr. Mba has expertise in African philosophy, transference, post-colonialism, social and political philosophy, especially global justice, as well as in political theory of the global south. He also has competence in philosophy of science and philosophy of culture. He has actually published so widely in both international and local journals in this subject area. I'm also honored to say that he is a immediate seminar coordinator, which reason I always refer to him as my boss. So I'm happy to say I have my boss sharing today's seminar. Let me hand over.
Yeah, no, always wanted to Thank you for having us. And indeed, it's exciting to have us all back again. This is the second in the series of the Israel African Studies seminars this academic year under competent mentorship of my colleague. So everyone is welcome. It's always exciting. This African seminar series, as you already know by now, share all the important conversations based on the stuff that has happened. So it's either you are joining our seminars, whether you're with our seminars, or you are really participating in the University of Ghana, any seminars ongoing. It's all in. We are very excited to have today Fischer. So the name of the author that he wants to engage with and his name are almost difficult. So I forgive the fact that so Dr. Fischer is assistant professor of Washington University in Wisconsin. He received his PhD in German studies from Stanford. His research focuses on machines of modern making, aesthetic, social, and political critics, as well as on forms of resistance in 20th century literature and visual art. He has published articles in Bedford, Red, Alexander Flip, Peter Weiss, and Dina Hazel. We are very privileged to have Dr. Andrew join us today. Dr. Fischer.
Okay, I'm going to take over. Please let me know if you can hear me or cannot hear me, or speak up. Okay, so I would like to thank, just to start with, the people who invited me to come to Accra with that fellowship, Professor Kwame, Professor Samuel Tangi Mensa, and my program mentor, Ladova. I also would like to thank Samuel and Fischer for welcoming me so kindly here at South African Studies. I also thank Dr. Hasiatu Abubakari for allowing me to speak here in the IAS seminar series, and as well as Dr. Chika Mba, who agreed to serve as today's chair. I will try to share my screen with you. And I hope this is working. Okay, so before I start with my actual paper, I would like to context about my research, because I'm not a scholar of African studies or anthropology. So by training, I'm a scholar of modern literature, and over the years, I have worked on film and art. My first book, The Aesthetics of Myth-Making, is coming out this fall with Northwest Press, and it is investigated by German writers, filmmakers, artists of the post-war period refer to the practice of myth making for existential orientation and historical reflection. So in this book, one chapter deals with Fichte, you see here on the left, who is a German writer and a self-taught ethnologist who cultures of the African diaspora. Loud enough? Okay, yes. So when my talk today will focus on what I call this poetic syncretism, my current research also seeks to compare the perspectives of African and American writers on the poetics and aesthetic African traditional religions. Okay, so since most of you will not be familiar with Fichte at all, I will begin with a sorry. I will begin with a biographical introduction before moving to poetic syncretism as first developed in Brazil. And then I will move on to Fichte's work on the traveling myth of Agostinate and enslaved queen of Dahomey before focusing. Sounds still working? Yeah. Focusing on Fichte's reflection on the Greek historian Herodotus and African culture. There's some kind of reverb. I hope this is okay. I don't know. All right. So, and for those of you who are interested to hear more about Hubert Fichte, there's going to be a workshop on Fichte right here in this room on February 21st at 3 p.m. Where I will be discussing this with other scholars. Okay, so I'm going to Hubert Fichte was born in 1935, the year of the racist Nuremberg laws, as the illegitimate son of a German mother and a Jewish father who fled the Nazi regime and who in Nazi jargon and fiction, he was a half-breed of the first degree, which put him at high risk of deportation to Auschwitz or another nation camp. To prevent this, his mother sent him from his hometown Hamburg to a Catholic orphanage area, which Fichte later treated in his novel The Orphan. One of the few texts that actually have been translated into English. When Fichte, still a child, returned to Hamburg in 1943, the Allied bombings began. That was little more than half of the city, and this experience remained a trauma surfacing throughout Fichte's writing. After the war, he began working as a child actor in a Hamburg theater. He dropped out of school to become a shepherd in France, and then worked in agriculture and became a part-time farmer. As an adolescent, Fichte discovered that he was gay and or bisexual. He used both emotions actively integrated that into his poetology. The bisexuality of genders and the high continentality of Africa and America were essential for him. Fichte grew up in a political environment in post-war Germany where homosexuality was illegal until 1969. So he was familiar with the situation that his sexual identity could not be expressed publicly. But write about queer subculture in an explicit language that was still uncommon in literature at the time. Despite numerous relationships with men, Fichte's lifelong partner was woman photographer Leonore Mann, who would feature in his novels as Ilma. The two protagonists Jackie would travel Brazil, the Caribbean, and West Africa, and published a number of books about this. These are 3 volumes that contain photos, photographies by Mao, taken of various weekday scenes and rituals, for example, and texts of Fichte. So through the relationship with Mao, his first travel experiences, Fichte was encouraged to begin his career as a writer. His early fame peaked with the novel Die Palette in 1968, and he went on to publish for magazines like Spiegel and Zeit, major news outlets, produced radio features for the German public radio broadcast. All right. for these journalistic news to secure his funding for his extensive traveling to Africa and Americas. He was a guest at the Latino in Rome, Italy, institutes around the world, and he healed a lot of people. For example, Jorge Luis Borges, John Denis, Salvador Allende, Leopold Sédar Senghor, and many others. We see him here on the left with Senghor and on the right with Salvador Allende shortly before he was assassinated. So by the early 1970s, he made quite an impressive career, even though his books were never really read by large audiences. And it was as if by his induction to the cultural institutions of the Federal Republic of Germany, the Western literary public sphere, as if that allowed him and motivated him to distance himself that sphere by stylizing himself as a global polyglot. More significant was his reinvention as an ethnologist. So after having observed the march of the queer underground and the sex workers of his hometown Hamburg, his interest soon gravitated towards African cultures.
We are trying to use them.
This shift in focus was a result of extensive traveling in the 1960s and particularly Portugal, Egypt, and Morocco. I'm curious about the epistemological traveling and soon conceived a multi-volume novel for first. This idea was for the mathematical history of sensitivity until the rest that is until 19-volume project would remain fragment all of Fichte's work be seen in this context, in the context of this multi-volume novel project. Only was published in so we see here as part of this tremendous work trying to conceive of this. So the first main point, the inception of this project was the first voyage to Brazil in 1969, where Fischer begins to develop new post-colonial ways to he will travel with so why literary writer he wants to approach the culture of the African diaspora in a way that is intimate, not exploitative. Instead, his ethnological approach is trying to combine tourism, scientific work, immediacy, poetic form, and queer desire. All of these names were ethnopoetry or poetic anthropology, science, sensitivity, verbalizations, or queerness of the world. Since the strong influence on this poetic structure is the syncretism found in the African diaspora, it's best to refer to the structure as a poetic of syncretism. Poetics is to insight and integrate the ways in which Afro-diasporic religions generate meaning and forms of expression. And I hope it will become clearer what is meant by it. So, in an obvious way, poetic adaptation or integration of African culture by a white author stands in a long and problematic history of colonialism, justification, and exoticization. When typically the white European that suffers from the dislocation of Western civilization escapes to a location of cultural otherness where they seek some kind of spiritual renewal. Strong and practice belongs to the core of modernity, imperialist expansion, and colonialism. He was well aware of this tradition, was not able to ever fully associate himself with it. Polemics against, for example, Roman rule is explained by this fear to be part of colonial history, not of an anti-colonial history she would have designed. So broad artists basically as yet another white Western intellectual seeking to
constructs a colonial other for its own self-history have to be considered seriously. However, as I would hope, Fichte's writings confront this issue in a way that complicates it. Perhaps the short passage might illustrate how he addresses and integrates precisely this colonial tradition that he finds himself. So I'm talking now about his novel about Brazil. It's called Explosion. First published in 1993, so a few years after his death, and only recently translated into Greek. So, and in that novel, there's
okay, replaced by impressions of the social and political realities of the Brazilian military dictatorship. In the text that Jackie, that is Fichte, produces during their visit to Rio, newsreel sections inspired by John Dos Passos assemble daily events, police reports, and gossip to dynamic sequences in which the reality of crime and police terror is contrasted with Jackie's and Irma's touristic explorations. In their luxury hotel on the Copacabana, their luxury hotel on the Copacabana not only hosts former and current dictators, but also the ones who are in Rio to observe sacrificial Yoruba rites. Quote, and Jackie, who gladly does without the evening paper, but cannot live without Le Monde, sits on the bed of the posh hotel and reads that the Rolling Stones are staying here with him at the Copacabana Palace because they wanted to attend the sacrifices for Yemanya on the beaches of Rio. Who is Yemanya and what kind of rites are these? End of quote. Fichte reveals that his curiosity about the African religions and their syncretistic forms in the Americas was triggered by a newspaper article about the Rolling Stones. The mystery of the holy other is embedded in a reality where pop culture, police terror, and mass tourism are equally present. In search of a candomblé ritual, Jackie and Irma wander through the favelas of Rio for hours, trying to locate a macumba ceremony, as the word of mouth directs them through the impoverished settlements until they hear the drums. I quote, now it's midnight. There's drumming. Jackie hears it for the first time. Drums in the night. It's as if the sky turned into membranes of his brain. Everywhere there's drumming now. Hurrying, stumbling, beating cameras over thresholds, poles, children, pigs, tin cans. Where is it? Behind every hut. There ahead, behind them, a maze of vibrating eardrums. End of quote. Instead of observing from above, as his privileged position would suggest, Jackie tries to adopt a position at eye level when he tries to observe every detail around him, or as in this case, register the sounds of human voices, drums, animals, or cowbells, which remind him of his traumatic Bavarian childhood. This receptivity is a reciprocal method of opening himself up to what is around him, but also projecting his own subjective experience onto the phenomena he registers. The outer heartbeat is an image that Fichte also used in his book, and it may serve as a paradoxical metaphor for Fichte's idea of sensitivity. So the quote goes, drums from the mountains, outer heartbeat, the heart of the world wrapped around me. And just to make clear, this is not poetry. This is like embedded in one text, in one sort of documentary novel text. So as Jackie hears the drums, simultaneity of acoustic, visual, olfactory perceptions becomes a rapid succession of poetic expression, as if following a rhythm or a heartbeat. Once Jackie and Irma find a ceremony they can participate in, the poetic crescendo rises with the rhythm of the ritual. Incomprehensible chants, Low German, African. One of the shiny men shouts, adoração, worship, prayer. The mothers, girls, Indians, fathers, daughters unfold white starch, freshly flattened cloths. The smell of cocoa, chestnuts, and worn underpants spreads through the hut. The cloths are laid on the ground. The word. Now everyone throws themselves into the cloths. Gymnastic lessons, belly up backwards, complicated slants, chants, adoração, over and over again, sleep, giddy up, or is it death? Powder crosses are drawn on the ground, letters are burned, water, small explosions at first. End of quote. The highly condensed description leaves no room for a spatial temporal structure that would allow for any kind of analysis. Everything seems to happen at once as the simultaneity of sense perception overwhelms the reader. In the Macumba ceremony, the priestesses then begins a dance in the state of possession, and the young mothers participating throw their newborns in her direction. Young mothers throw their infants to the possessed women. They fly through the air like bats. The mother of the saints puffs cigar smokes at them. End of quote. Instead of describing the functional structure of the ceremony that would appear as some kind of baptism, thereby reducing it to predetermined categories, Fichte reproduces Jackie's various impressions in a non-hierarchical way. Every element is of equal importance, and the privileged position of the observer and the limitations to observe are always made clear. The next quote, "That's a German," the others say assiduously. "But he is all white." "Yeah, he's completely white. He's from Europe." "Europe? Where's that?" "Up there on the right." The colonial gaze is directed back at the ethnographer, and although Jackie and Irma are unable to escape their positions, this perspective complicates their perception of the rituals. Fichte's declared goal is that the ritual logic unknown to him transpires into his writing, thereby allowing for a new language, which ultimately remains inaccessible to him. What he doesn't see is such a new language, which he seeks in the Afro-diasporic rituals, could ultimately only be articulated by those who practice it. In another tourist handbook, Jackie reads for the first time about the ethnologist Pierre Berger, who would later become his mentor and imagined rival. The passage already reveals his own petty envy of the famous ethnologist. I quote, "And there was talk of a European photographer who had written reference books about these mixed religions and had taken pictures of them. Jackie was annoyed by this. A formerly rich Frenchman who had given up his family and his standing to photograph his way through South America 40 years ago, or 20, and who had brought back to Africa the stones of the goddess Yamanya from Bahia de Todos os Santos, the Black Rose, with as many churches as there are days." End of quote. Berger had already discovered what Fichte was only about to begin to fathom, namely the bicontinental history of African-American syncretism, with which he sought to inspire his ethnopoetic writing style. Over the next years, Fichte begins to familiarize himself with the pantheon of the Vodun and returns to Brazil in 1971 to work with Berger. Through him, Fichte learns about the myth of Agotime, a woman from the Mahi region that was enslaved by the kingdom of Dahomey, where she served as a priestess. She was married to King Anglongo and mother of the later King Gezo, but was sold by King Adandozan to slave traders and shipped to Bahia, where she worked again as a priestess and a healer. Gezo later tried to bring her back, but the versions of this myth are many. Adandozan was erased from the history of Dahomey. Fichte recounts another version of the story as he reads it in the Brazilian newspaper. The king of the Nago of Obo, Nigeria, invited the royal family of Dahomey to a feast in 1796 to have them murdered. The king of Dahomey did not come himself. He sent 8 of his children and 9 priests, all of whom were arrested upon arrival in Obo and taken to the slave ship to Brazil, to São Luís do Maranhão. During the voyage, the royal prisoners bought their freedom with jewels And when they arrived in Sao Luis, they founded the Casa das Minhas. This is reported by the Maranhão newspaper Imparcial on December 7, 1976, in an unsigned article. It is a report that turns all evidence and all probability onto its head in such a way that the story might just happen like that. Might just have happened like that. End of quote. So this traveling myth of Agotime, who is credited with introducing the worship of Vodun in Brazil, is at once the representative of African-American syncretism, as well as of Fichte's writing practice of assembling gossip and historical facts. Moreover, the bicontinental scope of the myth is emblematic for Fichte's interest in the African diaspora. Reconnecting the two hemispheres on both sides of the Atlantic by exploring a supposedly forgotten myth and integrating it into his project became the telos for Fichte's autoethnography. On the example of the Agotime myth, Fichte seeks to show how in rituals, elements of both sides of the Atlantic are preserved in the names of deities and ancestors, in the usage of plants and animals, as well as in the rhythms of the drums, in chants and dances. The breaking of the consciousness of the individual, the obrigação da consciência, in order to liberate it from rational, psychological, and colonial constraints, is an idea that Fichte consistently highlights. Though not focusing on religious experience, Paul Gilroy has stressed the importance of music for the African diaspora as, I quote, an expressive counterculture, as a philosophical discourse which refuses the modern Occidental separation of ethics and aesthetics, of culture and politics, end of quote. While Fichte remained skeptical about the emancipatory potential of religion, he also saw its revolutionary aspects, which resonate with Gilroy's understanding of the culture of the Black Atlantic as a critique of Western modernity. During his third stay in Brazil from 1981 to 82, Fichte worked in collaboration with the Brazilian anthropologist Sergio Ferretti on the Casa das Minhas in São Luís do Maranhão, the temple of Agotime. Over the course of 8 months, he and Ferretti conducted regular interviews with the two main priestesses of the temple. While Ferretti was a trained anthropologist and committed to objectivity, Fichte sought a more personal, intimate approach. For example, when he learned that Dona Denis, one of the priestesses, wanted to travel herself to Dahomey and to Togo, he offered to teach her French. From these lessons, Fichte was able to obtain more and more personal information about the priestess. Ferretti admired Fichte's ability to conduct interviews, but was ultimately more interested in a systematic approach to the religious practices at the temple. Fichte, on the other hand, was not interested in making the mythological structures of Candomblé legible to his audience. The main reason for this is Fichte's refusal to prioritize academic discourse over the literal speech of his informants. For him, epistemic colonialism begins where the researcher synthesizes the language of the interlocutors into pre-established categories. This is Fichte's charge, however well-founded it may be, against Lévi-Strauss and ethnology in general. It suspects the colonial occupation behind the gesture of hermeneutic understanding. In contrast, Fichte's mode of presentation is the collage of quotations, or rather a transcript of an interview in which the questions and the questioner are being left out. With this technique, Fichte is trying to foreground Denis' life and struggles as a Black working-class woman for whom the religious space offers some level of autonomy from social oppression. This is, of course, paradoxical because being a Vodunsi entails the submission under a Vodun of which one is possessed, which in her case, it's a male Vodun. So here's another lengthy quote, but it gives you an impression of what these texts look like. So this is now Donna Denis Plata Jardim, the priestess of the temple in Dahomey, talking about her life. My great-grandparents had been taken from Africa as slaves. Dad worked on the railroad. Mother worked in the field. I worked in a private household from 41 to 44 to pay for high school. I got married. I had a son right away and another. That broke up my life. Just before I started working in the factory in February 44, then I was 19. Quote goes on for a bit, but you get the sense that this is basically a very sort of personal biographical account that she's giving. And then she transitions. So here on in the picture, we see Fichte and Donna Denis during one of their conversations. So this is around 1980 in Maranhão. So Denis says, at night, I read a lot. When I wanted to know something, I read the Bible. When I wanted to know something, I light a candle in the Blessed Sacrament and ask my Mr. Lepon for advice. I began to see a poor old man. I did not know that it was my master, Mr. Lepon, the Vodun. I did not know I had a Vodun. When you are a child, you have the second sight and you don't know it. This gift must be developed by the mothers. So mothers here are the priestesses. End of quote. So Fichte wanted to know the personal histories in order to ground the religion in a concrete social context that allowed for a critical perspectives. Listening to the priestesses, Fichte interprets the slow decay of the temple as an act of resistance of the women against the multi-layered patriarchy. And so this is now Fichte. Both women, Agotime and Denis, the founder of the religion and its last mediator, had reason to hate the world of men and its symbols and not to love the sexes. Lekba, the earth dumpling with a giant penis, should not exist. Preserving and destroying the cult, carrying the destructive Vodun along and forgetting it in rebellion. That becomes clear time and again in the history of the Casa das Minas. The discretion and elegance of the cult of the queen, the conscientiousness and refinement are, like all sublimation, paid for with neurosis. The Vodun, the rites, the trance become so refined that they can no longer wash away the disease. End of quote. Underlying this interpretation is a process of civilization as refinement that produces unintended side effects, very much like Freud's Civilization and its Discontent, that is referenced in the relation between sublimation and neurosis. And it would seem that Fichte's view is a nostalgic one that looks back at a lost origin. In its opening pages, for example, Fichte frames this approach as an archaeology of a mentality, an approach that lays bare what mythical thought might once have looked like. Ethnology deals with rites that are being performed. The following text deals with rites that are no longer performed, a lengthy fastening of consolidated fragments. It is the archaeology of a religion and a mentality. Archaeology, speaking of what may have been in the beginning. End of quote. There's a tension between the impossibility of that origin and the history of syncretism that has shaped these religious rites. It is precisely the syncretism, the mixing, adapting, and transforming of rites and myths that offers a historic archive to those who take it seriously. Fichte's main interest in the Agotime myth is based on the transcultural significance of the Black Atlantic, not only with regards to religious practices, but more importantly, regarding his idea that the cultural practices separated by history, and that is the history of the transatlantic slave trade, have a deeper anthropological connection. After concluding his study at the Casa das Minas, Fichte traveled to Benin several times, but then in 1984, to the royal court of Abomey, sent on a mission by the Brazilian priestesses. They had not conducted the ritual for Zomadonu, the Vodun of Agotime, in over 70 years in Maranhão. And the last priestess who knew how to perform it had died recently. Fichte's mission was to request the lacking information and the authorization for the ceremony from the king. This is a picture of Fichte in Abomey, his appointment with the king, and he has a message from the priestesses in the form of a necklace that has a symbolic code on it, so color code. So he hands that over, and tape recordings of chants from the priestesses from Maranhão. Yeah, he tries to function here as some kind of messenger. But the response of the princes frustrates him. If the priestesses don't learn the initiation rite for Somadonu, then the temple is going to ruins. At the Amazon, they haven't initiated anyone to Somadonu in 70 years. We have also not initiated anyone for the last 4 decades. It's too expensive. It takes too long. The first initiation takes 3 months. The second one takes more than an entire year. Just think about what the costs for food are, and the sacrifices and presents for everyone for an entire year. End of quote. So the last part were the princes speaking. The loss of sacred knowledge and the loss of its significance does not just threaten the gods abroad, but also at their supposed place of origin. Fichte's source of disappointment is that he would not be able to bring back the crucial information to Brazil and save the temple. This white savior complex of sorts is contrasted with the realization that the elaborate rites do not correspond any longer to an economic system that could support them. Fichte reflects this problematic position and tries to reconcile it in a grand historical narrative. So I'm coming to my last major point. In 2 essays on the influence of African culture on European culture, Fichte's point of orientation is his friend Herodotus. Essays like this one, or his fierce polemics against Lévi-Strauss, mainly function as poetological commentaries on his own work, and put his writings on the Agotime myth in a broader context of transcultural and transhistorical ethnology. Herodotus becomes the role model for Fichte's form of research because he represents, I quote, the totality of his age in text. For Fichte, the contemporary equivalent would be the New York Times. A totality, in Herodotus' case, that is perceived from a subjective perspective. Herodotus is a traveler gathering knowledge about other cultures. And according to Fichte, his impulse to travel is sex. I quote, Herodotus, my friend, his wanderlust, his inability to sit still. What's behind that corner? What's behind that ridge? Not knowledge is power, but rather travel is knowledge. Sex, and the first prose author also writes the first Psychopathologia Sexualis. With more felicity than Freud, Herodotus' works implies that one travels on account of sex, that travel is a sexual need, writing and discovery. Described in this way, Herodotus is a direct precursor of Fichte, interested in precisely the same questions about the relation between desire and knowledge and the African roots of European culture. This Herodotus seems to be located between magic and naturalism, between the Homerian epic and the tragedies of Sophocles, preserving the cultic chants of the ancestors in a language that conveys and preserves these litanies in prose. In other words, Fichte is creating a tradition for himself, not only in the literary sense, but also for his emphatic concept of knowledge and hypostasization of research that he tries to put in opposition to what he sees as the academic establishment. In this view, Herodotus is the first and Fichte the last ethnologist in a tradition, while in between, the wrong exploitative colonial history has occurred that now needs to be undone. I quote from the same essay, "It remains inconceivable that this curious beginning was followed by such an uncurious Europe, for which knowledge rarely meant something other than power. The European history of colonization remains a history of insensitivity, just like the uncurious idealism of European philosophy, scholasticism, prayer mills, and a view limited by blinkers. Already Thales stumbled into a well before the eyes of a maid. The errors of practical perception fill the volumes of Aristotle, Sartre, and Lévi-Strauss. The lack of curiosity for the real world has then led to a paradigm of epistemological dominance over what is deemed unknown, mysterious, or primitive. Instead, Herodotus' model respects other forms of knowledge, such as that of sacred rituals, and does not try to translate it into the epistemological structures of his own discourse. Of course, the majority of Fichte's essay on Herodotus consists of speculations and rhetorical questions that insinuate the mirror image as Fichte as a modern Herodotus and Herodotus as an ancient Fichte. On the fringes of institutional knowledge, this affinity frames his transhistorical and transcultural understanding of ethnology that Fichte seeks to realize in his history of sensitivity. Thus, the reflection of Herodotus' histories, the epistemological, the aesthetic, and also the ethical dimension of such an undertaking are fathomed programmatically. I quote again, Herodotus' work ends in horror, in sadistic rites, wholly pessimistic. However, and this must be said, it nowhere contains a defense of racism. It never takes the side of those who try to interfere with the sex lives of others. He never offers apologies for abduction and slavery, as can be found in the Bible, in the elegant Aristotle, or in the New York Times. With Herodotus as his role model, Fichte promotes his own investigation of African and African American rituals as deeply connected to the research of the ancient historian. Central to this connection is the claim that Greek culture has become the model, which has become the model for European culture, is itself influenced by the cultures from the Bight of Benin. Another quote. Is African American culture a fanciful idea of a few escapists no longer able to orient themselves in their native culture, who therefore flee into the realm of the exotic? Are African American rights a patchwork, a remainder, faded and stale on the margins of the United States? Or do archaic originary moments surface within African American syncretism? Contrasts of human behavior and consciousness, just as in Greek tragedies or the works of Monteverdi, Artaud, Hitchcock? Was Yahweh, who created Adam and Eve, and Zeus, from whose head Athena sprang, black, or at least Afro-European? Oedipus as a voodoo? Fichte describes his own predisposition accurately in the first sentence, only to juxtapose this exoticism with the anthropological claim that the gods worshipped in Europe originated in Africa. The syncretism that he encountered for the first time in Brazil would then only be the latest variation in a long history of transcultural religion. This idea is not new and was most forcefully developed by Leo Frobenius, whose influence Fichte loudly conceals, but whose history of Atlantis, with all its racist underpinnings, he tries to reverse. African culture has not ceased since antiquity to exude its influence on European culture. The entanglement of a colonial gaze and an anti-colonial cultural critique in Frobenius, which had influenced writers of the Negritude, such as Césaire and Senghor, is a heritage of Fichte's project. Therein, the exoticism and the idea of primitive cultures is revealed as a colonial ideology, but more importantly, European culture as well comes into view under these conceptual premises. I quote, one could easily arrive at a Unitarian ring around the rosies, ingratiating and exploitative, adding to the drivel about similar structures, slapping the African Oedipus good-naturedly on the shoulder and giving the Haitian Aphrodite a lascivious pinch. That is not how I mean it. I would rather demonstrate at Herodotus' detailed descriptions that certain rites that we can observe in African religions still today have had a place in European culture since the classical period, and that they neither represent a regression nor an atavistic relic. Herodotus and the trans, not to once more prove the superiority of the Western tradition over the so-called primitive peoples, but the other way around, to suggest confluent streams of Nubian, Libyan, Ethiopian waves and their Carian, Ionian, and Attic countercurrents. The allegorical notions of confluence and countercurrents appear as conceptual stopgaps in the context of Fichte's poetic gestures, as they point towards cultural reconciliation. It also harmonizes a violent historical process in order to signal an alternative to hierarchical understandings of cultures. As David Simo highlighted, Fichte tries to distance himself from anthropological generalizations that all cultures share the same archetypical structures, and argues for a historical antecedence of African cultures, whose influence he tries to trace from Greek antiquity to Baroque aesthetics and modernism. Beyond his fetishization of Black bodies, Fichte is interested in constructing cultural otherness or cultural alterity for the purpose of bringing to light the ritualistic layers of his own identity. Again, the construction of the other for one's own self-discovery. This enlightened impetus of revealing himself in confrontation with the other wants to avoid exoticization without ever being able to escape it. He exclaims at one point, "I want to liberate the African-American culture from its exotic isolation," not realizing that nobody is waiting for him to be liberated. So I come to my conclusion. It is the fundamental contradiction in Fichte's ethnographic work and his history of sensitivity that he tries to fulfill his exotic desire for the cultural other in a non-colonial, non-exploitative way. His insistence on rigor, precision, knowledge, science, and truth are mere rhetorical devices to legitimate his endeavor and to not continue his European discourse of exoticism. What he calls new science is surely not scientific in any academic sense, even if he articulated positions that contemporaneously emerged in the writing culture discourse of James Clifford and Mary Louise Pratt. But he did so in a form that remains legible only as literature and that refuses to open itself up to reciprocal inquiry. Ultimately, Fichte was engaged in a poetics of syncretism that attempted to assemble what is incommensurable between cultures and temporalities. In its fragmentary character, this poetics is suggesting that everything is connected, that the gods are merely variations of one another, that there is one hidden mythology linking Shango and Zeus, Agotime and Iphigenia, and Herodotus and Fichte himself. Despite his grand proclamations, the fragment that remains is neither fiction nor science in any straightforward sense, as it attempted to fuse both in order to create a post-colonial mythology, a new mythology of reason. Fichte would have rejected nothing more than a poeticization of knowledge, of which the German romantics and idealists speak. Likewise, the striking parallels to Alexander von Humboldt's endeavors in the Americas mark an obvious tradition in which he would not like to be placed. Any suspicion of cultural dominance would raise his doubts, even where it is articulated in a progressive voice. Instead of traveling to find out that they are almost like us, it is his desire that we are almost like them, and that what we have taken for reason is a myth whose origins we have forgotten. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andrea. As someone is saying online, it's such an enlightening presentation. And I'm sure that we are going to have an interesting dialogue thereafter. So it's time for us to take questions. We have all of 30 minutes to take questions and comments from those in location and those online. So if you do have questions and you are in location, you can raise your hand, and then those online can raise their virtual hand, and then we'll take questions and comments 3 a page. Then Professor Samuel Ntosh.
Thank you very much. This is very enlightening and indeed very rich. I have a question for Fischer. In the presentation, you did indicate that difficulty in initiations these days is as a result of the fact that it's expensive. So my question is, was the cost of initiation in the past low? Or is it the case that in those days they had higher income levels than now? That makes it cheaper? Or is it just lack of commitment and interest in initiation these days that makes people draw the general conclusion that it is expensive? Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Professor Toes. And then somebody wanted to speak in location. Professor.
Yeah, thanks. I was wondering briefly, can you tell us the philosophies underpinning your presentation? You can relate them in methodology as well. So the key philosophical footprint underpinning the presentation, and maybe in relation to the methodologies you adopted for the work. Thank you.
Respond to this.
Okay, thank you for these questions. So I'm first going to respond to Professor Ntowusu's question about the cost of initiation at Abomey. I don't know, but there are sort of certain things to perhaps to speculate there, that at the time when Dahomey was still a kingdom, the level of they had different means of income. I mean, clearly they had a quite oppressive social system that would accumulate the riches of the country at the court in Abomey. So they don't have that political power anymore since 1900, since the French took over. So that's a clear historical fact. If there's, in addition to that, a lack of commitment, I guess that's likely, but I cannot answer that for sure. So one would have to sort of investigate more. One anecdotal point I could perhaps make is that I recently went to the court of Abomey myself and talked to the current Queen Mother, who is a descendant of Agotime, and to some of her relatives. And one of their relatives said that he traveled to Maranhão not too long ago and complained in a way that they're doing the rituals wrong. They're not doing it the way it's supposed to be done, and they're exaggerating. They're doing more than they should. So he was showing some commitment and some sort of dedication to the cause. So so that would be sort of, I mean, I don't know if it's evidence, but it's on some level anecdotal. But that's what this member of the royal family in Abomey told me. Yes, but interesting question. Philosophies and methodologies. I mean, there's a bigger arc to this, and that's why I bring up in the end these idealist and romantic ideas about new mythologies, about another kind of knowledge, about the knowledge to be found in irrational forms of expression, a counter-enlightenment, if you will. So the longer history of that would be, I mean, Fichte is very Eurocentric in his references. That I hope that became clear. He is not engaging with African thinkers at all. He is not engaging with African writers at all, apart from Senghor, whose poetry he read. But other than that, it's very almost an obsession with the European canon that he tries to devise himself. So he takes pride in not talking about certain famous people, and then, for example, his focus on German Baroque poetry, which is kind of neglected. I mean, other than experts, very few people really talk about that in the grand scheme of things. So that's really one sort of intellectual operation that he is doing. What I'm doing is trying to uncover this. What I'm doing is basically a commentary on his method, sort of, because when you read it, it's not at all clear. You can read these texts and you have no idea what this ritual is for or about. He sort of resists academic discourse whose ambition it would be to explain that. He thinks he wants to integrate that into one ethnopoetic textual form, right? So for me, my methodology is basically unpacking that, trying to figure out what are these references, how is he putting them together, why does he think that Baroque drama and Brazilian candomblé are related, and how? So the same blood rights happen there, and so he is very interested in suggesting these analogies, and thereby I think really wants to insinuate that African culture, what he thinks African culture is, in these references, can be found in European culture everywhere, so that there is not a difference, but sort of an ancient influence of African culture onto European culture. So that's kind of, I'm basically just trying to uncover that with all my philological abilities here. So, and I'm just like Fichte, I'm clearly lacking the expertise on African writers and African thinkers who know much more about this than he does and than I do. So this is sort of part of my current research to figure out what some of this means, sort of apart from this particular poetic project. So I'm rambling a bit, but I hope that answered your question to some extent.
Or indeed, Prof has a follow. Prof. James, a follow. Okay. Yeah. Please kindly introduce yourself and then.
Cultural anthropology, professor at University of Frankfurt. Thank you very much, Andre, for your presentation. Really appreciate it, and it was very teaching for me. It's like going through a house, plenty of rooms, and all doors are open, and you have the question where to enter, and you do not know what you will discover behind the door. Also, the door is open since long. You have never entered the room, so you make me enter the room, and it's really several questions that come up for me, and it's really worrying me a little bit. If I look back to Alexander von Humboldt, I consider him as one of those first who were convinced of the power of observation. You look at something, you stare at an object or at a scenery of ritual, and you have the impression you know something, you learn something by looking. For me, this is typically modern, and this is the success of Humboldt in the 19th century, that he was really claiming a modern principle. Go to a place, have a look, and once you have seen it, you can be a witness, you can explain. And this is kind of prehistory of anthropology or ethnography in large. Go somewhere, have a look closer, observe, and observation is knowledge, and knowledge is science, you see? That's the modernist principle, scholarship. And nowadays, we anthropologists are skeptical against that. Is it really possible to know something just by observing? It's more than doubtful. So what was Fichte's position with regard to that? Was he convinced that his observation contributes to knowledge? Or what is the aim of his kind of observation?
Andrea, maybe if we go back to the discussions we were having earlier about the limitations of language. And the very fact that language in many cases is unable to pierce through what is ontologically given. And so if you add that to that further complicates the situation. So maybe now, but then I do have Jonathan Budo online. So Jonathan, can you unmute and then make a comment or ask a question?
All right, yeah, thank you very much. It's been a very wonderful presentation, although I joined quite late. Yeah, but the part that I heard, you were talking about Herodotus and the model of Herodotus. So at that point, then I started wondering about historical methodology. What I got from Herodotus' histories is that in most cases, he didn't travel to most of the places that he wrote about. He collected, stories from people. Now, so comparing that to Fichte's strategy, he traveled to most of the places. And so it's also connected with this idea of a methodology. So can you speak about this Herodotus methodology a little bit vis-a-vis Fichte's methodology, and also comparing that to Hegel and so on, who did not travel to Africa, but made certain important or certain claims about Africans south of the Sahara?
Thank you, Jonathan. Maybe we can take one more question in location. Okay. Maybe you go for that too. Or is it 3 now, since I complicated the first question?
Okay, thank you again for this round of questions. Yes, the modern concept of knowledge, or how can we obtain knowledge? There's something that is at stake in Fichte. And short answer, ultimately, it would boil down that he is seeking some kind of poetic knowledge, right? So that all this, he uses very emphatically these terms, knowledge, science. It appears that he wants to be more scientific, more rigorous than the scientists, right? But it's clear that this is just rhetoric. He is a literary author. This has never been received really by scholarship. And there's a reason for that, because this is all part of one 19-volume novel. So there is, on the one hand, this hyperbole of science in his rhetoric, his emphatic concept of knowledge that is ultimately something like poetic knowledge, sort of pushing the boundaries of language with a suspicion that you might find sort of an expression that does not yet exist, and thereby expand what we know about the world, right? And that's something that he contrasts with, what he portrays. It's a caricature of academia, basically, especially his polemics against Lévi-Strauss, completely unfounded, and he knows that. He even comments on that he is completely overboard with his criticism of this. But that's all part, I think, of his self-fashioning as an author. That's why I think it's completely fine if his theory of knowledge is not taken seriously, but his theory of his poetics have to be taken seriously as literature. Sort of, I think that's where I would draw the distinction. And in a way, perhaps I'm also old-fashioned there. I still believe in sort of aesthetics, and that there's a value to that poetry and authors can actually really articulate something that scholars and scientists cannot. What we do with that then is another matter. And Humboldt specifically, I don't think he was important for Fichte. I don't think he referred to him, but the power of observation, I think he tried to identify that with Herodotus. I think that's what Herodotus meant for him. And I think he was probably an uncritical reader of Herodotus as well. I don't think he would question whether Herodotus actually went to Ethiopia or not. He said, okay, he subverted this kind of rigorous knowledge. He invented stories. He also said, there's, and I'm sort of to this second question here, that hearsay, gossip, that these things are as valuable as verified knowledge. What Herodotus also, he doesn't reveal information that he has, right? Sort of he does not share knowledge about sacred rituals that he witnesses, because he says that's a different category. So Fichte really tries to copy that, or like invent himself as this version of Herodotus as he understands him. Stories from other people, I think that's crucial. I mean, what he mainly did, apart from observing and describing, was interviewing people. He was talking to people all the time, and he was a very prolific interviewer. I mentioned that with the high-profile interviews that he did, but he would, just constantly interview people with a tape recorder, and that part of sort of queering knowledge and sort of the ethical aspects of his methods, that he would obtain knowledge from people that he slept with, and that making that public, writing about that, how he obtained that knowledge, was also for him very important. He insinuated that people like Pierre Verger, who were also homosexual and who also had sexual contacts with people with whom they were working, they didn't reveal that information. And for Fichte, that was sort of unscientific on Verger's part, and that was more scientific on his part. Sort of that would be his line of argument there. I didn't get the second part of the question. Did you say Hegel or Herder who said something about Africa? That was Jonathan's question, and I wouldn't know either way. So please don't ask me about Hegel or Herder.
Yeah, so we can take a couple of more questions and then we'll be done. Otherwise, yeah, okay, I'm just saying that from Charles Atolia. Quite interesting presentation. What I wanted to know is which African thinkers or writers you have had discussions with leading to a sessions. You know, I was going to actually add that to Professor J. Mensah's earlier question. So if Page was caught in that trap of exoticization, how did you, in your own research, attempt to transcend that same difficulty? Time ago, somebody was talking about this discursive position. Somebody who was, maybe Nathan Susaitba at Emory University, he was visiting us here, writing on Nigerian poetry, researching on the time of the Mbari Club, you know, Christopher Okigbo and his cohort. And one of the ways in which he characterized Okigbo's work was that Okigbo was particularly concerned by the idea that somehow scholars in the West, poets in the West, are able to influence or have in fact historically influenced poets in Africa or in the non-West, but that for Kigbo and of course for Susaitma, it does appear that a more honest account of that history, of that interchange, would be what he called a discursive possession, which is to say that in many more cases than have been reported, there have been influences by poets from the non-West, in Africa in particular, on Western poets, some of the most notable ones, in fact. And then there's this suggestion that part of this problem, the reason why there is this dislocation, in terms of how these histories and how these intellectual histories surrounding some of these works of poetry, that part of the problem is about framing, is about how the research in poetry or writing, our attempt to interpret poetry, how that has always been Eurocentric, more or less. That's the reason why some of all this, why this eliding thing happens. So if I understand, okay, so following his question right now, that's Charles Atolia. So then, and Professor J. Mensah's question, I was wondering whether you were, how, I know clearly, having discussed with you previously, that you are acutely aware of this challenge. But how, in fact, or to what extent do you think you are successful in that?
Thank you for this question. I think I won't be able to say whether I'm successful yet. That's to be seen. One thinker and writer that first came to my mind and where Sir first tried to look into, even though he's very different. He's a playwright and very high profile, not to compare to Fichte, and that's Wole Soyinka, and his essays on myth and the African worldview, and also his plays, his adaptation of Euripides' plays, and his tragedies. So he wrote a number of essays that are, well, not easily to summarize or to pinpoint, but it's he actively seeks there to make this connection very much like Fichte does between Ogun and Dionysus and Shango. So he tries to compare the Vodun pantheon to the Greek pantheon and contour what he presents as the African worldview. And he particularly criticizes the idea of that poetry has to be confined to literature, sort of that poetry is not to be other, so for example, in rituals. And if I want to articulate something redeeming about Fichte, part of his skepticism not to engage with contemporary literary writers is, I think, his attempt to find poetry something that is not published literature, that does not partake in the literary market, but that takes place in the lives of the people, that is integrated in the social realities, as he assumes ceremonies and rituals are. Sort of, that's, I think, part of his reason not to engage more with contemporary writers of stage. And I found some echoes of that in Soyinka, but of course, he is a literary writer. He writes in English. He is a Nobel Prize winner. He is sort of checking all these boxes. He's a very successful author, sort of. So there's a big contradiction there. And beyond that, I'm sure there's an endless number of figures that I can and will and should engage with. But that would be sort of the main figure that so far I've seen that where there are resonances.
Well, might be a very good time to close the proceedings because I like to keep the time, though we started a bit later than we hoped. But if there is one or two more questions, but then if not, I will hand over to Dr. Abubakari. Perhaps there are some announcements, or maybe Dr. Fischer want to make some closing remarks, and then before I go over to the seminar coordinator, Dr. Fischer.
Well, just on that last point, any recommendations on how to continue this are very welcome. So thanks for coming.
All right. Thank you very much, Dr. Mba. We are very grateful and we appreciate your commitment to sharing this talk. Thank you. And to Dr. Chika, Dr. Fischer, we say thank you very much. Yes, the name. We say thank you very much for the wonderful talk. We really enjoyed it. And we look forward to the workshop on 21st of February at 3 p.m. There will be a workshop still on this subject matter. And just as it has generated a lot of debate questions here and there, we highly welcome you to join the workshop because it's going to be very exciting. Thank you. And next week, we have another very intriguing talk, and this will be delivered by Dr. Florian Fisch and Li Jung from Siegen University in Germany. And they will be talking about exploring the gender digital gap in music production. So we also welcome you to the next seminar session, which is on Thursday noon, right here, or we will communicate the venue to you. Thank you very much for making time to join us, those in line, those online, and then the people in house. Thank you and see you next week.